Professor Stone, I want to read something to you from today's Wall Street Journal print edition. It's a statement by President Putin, and it reads as such: Russia has every right to take retaliatory measures to ensure its own security. Now, I'm not pro-Putin, and I'm not discounting Mr. Putin's true intentions here. Regardless, I can't help but ask a following question. Are we Americans missing the big picture about Russia's true security fears? You identified some of them in the previous segments. I mean, when you look at Russia's history, even as a layperson such as I, they've been just invaded over and over again.
Yeah, so I do think it is fair to say that the U.S. public does not generally understand quite the way that Vladimir Putin and sort of the elite around him think about Russian security. I think that's fair to say. Mm-hmm. And I think it is important that we make an effort to understand his point of view. Now, I hasten to add that understanding the reasons that he thinks the way he does not necessarily mean approving.
Well, of course, yeah.
And so I hasten to add, I don't approve of the actions Vladimir Putin has taken.
Yes.
I think I can grasp some of the reasons why he takes the positions he does. So, as Putin presents it, his fundamental concern in Ukraine is threats to Russian security. I think he is systematically overestimating the degree to which Russia is under threat. I think he fundamentally misunderstands the nature of NATO and NATO intentions. At least as Vladimir Putin expresses himself, he sees NATO as presenting an imminent threat of attack on Russia. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The idea that—
Does he really believe that, or does he use that for propaganda purposes?
So that's an excellent question. He says it pretty consistently. Now, people can say things consistently and not mean them.
Yeah.
And the question that you're asking essentially requires us to get inside Vladimir Putin's head and read his mind. So it's impossible. You can never know for sure what's in anybody's head.
Exactly.
He consistently says that he believes that NATO is a threat to Russia to carry out an attack. When I look around the countries of NATO, and I note that NATO works by consensus, and I imagine to myself that the sort of 30-some countries of NATO would come to a consensus and agree that starting a war with Russia, a power with thousands of nuclear weapons, that NATO would come to a consensus that this is a good idea, is to me ludicrous. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so if Putin is thinking in terms that NATO is looking to attack Russia, I think he's out of touch with reality. Now, it's conceivable that this is sort of bargaining chip. I think deep down, I guess this is my read on Vladimir Putin's foreign policy, is that fundamentally what he wants is a Russia that dominates its neighbors. He sees the world as rightfully belonging to great powers that tell their smaller neighbors what to do. That, I think, is his vision of what ought to be. Wow. And the vision that's opposed to that, this is the vision of the United States, of NATO, of the European Union, is that small states enjoy sovereignty too. That smaller states have the right to determine what it is that they would like to do, how they want to organize their own affairs, what sorts of international arrangements they want to make. And so this is the kind of the conflict that's set up over Ukraine. The irony of this, one of the things that's clearly agitating Vladimir Putin is the possibility of Ukrainian membership in NATO.
Is that even remotely possible, Professor?
Well, so there's this. It's a complicated. I keep saying it again. This is a complicated question. In 2008, NATO said that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually become members of NATO. That they will become members of NATO at some point, unspecified in the future.
Now, when you say NATO said, was that a sort of doctrinal statement, or was that just sort of an interview with somebody?
So this is NATO has periodic summits. This was the 2008 Bucharest summit of NATO, and official statements come out of this. This was a NATO official statement that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. But again, no concrete plans, no timetables, just eventually. And most informed observers agree that eventually was more or less never, like the indistinguishable future. And again, no concrete plans to do it. And it was very clear in 2008 that there were a large number of European members of NATO that did not want to see Georgia and Ukraine in NATO. And so the compromise with the US that would like to see NATO expansion and European partners that didn't was no expansion, but this promise of eventual expansion. Now, in retrospect, speaking only for myself, I think that promise was a very bad idea. To make a promise, but with nothing concrete behind it, is the worst of both worlds. One of the things that's become clear is that for a number of members of NATO, the idea of bringing in a country that has territorial disputes is a non-starter. There's no official NATO charter statement that you can't bring in a country if it has territorial disputes. But a number of NATO members, it seems very clear, have decided they don't want to borrow trouble. They don't want to bring in a state with a territorial dispute. And since that Bucharest summit, Russia has created territorial disputes in Georgia and in Ukraine. And I think it's not hard to see a link there. That part of what Vladimir Putin is doing is sort of separating territories from neighboring states in order to throw a monkey wrench into the potential process of their becoming NATO members.
Does Russia's troop buildup around Ukraine sort of reflect Soviet Russian military strategies of the past? You know, propaganda, panic, instability, and sort of the surprise element. You never know what's going to happen next with them.
So I don't think it's particularly Soviet. And the reason I say that is because the Soviet Union was a superpower. It had 300 million people. Its East European empire had another 150 million people. It had enormous military resources. And so the Soviet Union didn't need to be particularly subtle in terms of military strategy. It had mass forces. Russia today is much smaller. Its military is smaller. And so it's up against, in NATO, an alliance that has much more potential power. So the Russians have to use methods of kind of misdirection in order to have any sort of chance. And so what I think we're seeing here is what now is often called hybrid warfare. In the past, it was sometimes called political warfare, but it's the idea that you combine a whole series of mechanisms. Political mechanisms, propaganda mechanisms, economic mechanisms, and potentially military mechanisms, all working together to try to achieve a particular goal. And I think what we can see in Ukraine over the last year or so is a combination of measures. Information warfare, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, and the threat of military action. And as you and I speak, there's been no new shooting yet. I hope there isn't. Can't rule it out.
Hopefully there won't be.
Talking, hopefully there will not. As of yet, there's been no additional shooting, but that threat is there. And again, to my mind, Vladimir Putin probably hasn't made up his mind yet whether he's going to use force, in that if he gets what he wants without using force, why would you use force?
Yeah.
But he does not have yet, I think, what it is he wants. But that, again, we're speculating a little bit on what's going on inside his head.
As a side note, I'm curious about this historical point. During Russia's civil war that occurred after the fall of the Romanov Empire, the U.S. sent a force. I don't know how large of a force it was. It wasn't an invasion. It was to essentially assist the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. Is that something that Putin brings up from time to time? America is the aggressors. They're the ones who have invaded us in the past, not us. Or is it just forgotten history?
Yeah. So it's interesting that intervention in the Russian Civil War. So the Russian Civil War runs from the revolution of 1917 up until it dies out 1920, 1921. And during that period of time, when there was a civil war inside Russia between the communist Reds and their white opponents, outside powers intervened. And the Soviet Union always sort of phrased it as the 14 intervening powers. Which exactly those 14 were is a little vague, but certainly among them were the British, the French, the Japanese, and the Americans. And so American troops went into the Soviet Far East at Vladivostok and into the Soviet Far North around Murmansk and Archangel in the very Soviet North. And yes, it was never a large force, but it was there to sort of provide some assistance to the whites, to safeguard war material that had been delivered during the First World War. And yes, that's not forgotten. The Soviets always made a big deal out of it. Vladimir Putin has not made as much of it. I think his grievances are focused a little more recently than that. I mean, it's still there. It's certainly part of Russian historical discourse, but Putin has made less of that than he has of more recent issues.
Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Stone as we get into the perspective. All right. Are you ready for the last segment?
Let's go. And how are we doing? Are we good in terms of time?
Oh yeah, 11. We're 39 minutes into it. We can spend 7 to 10 minutes here. Plenty. We did really well. Professor Stone, pundits speculate that Russia waited till the end of the Beijing Olympics before it takes bolder actions against Ukraine because Mr. Putin didn't want to upstage Mr. Xi or steal sort of his Olympic moment. This raises an interesting historical question for me. In its history, has Russia enjoyed true alliances with other nations? And I'm very cautious about the word alliance because the way I read history, the Warsaw Pact was more of sort of an agreement between vassal states to come and aid Soviet Union in case of a military conflict. It wasn't a true alliance in that sense of sort of equal partners.
So certainly there have been examples. Probably the best example of a real alliance of equals would be in the era before World War I. In the couple decades before World War I, both France and Russia saw themselves as under increasing pressure from Germany. Under the ancient principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, both France and Russia naturally saw each other as allies against Germany. And so France and Russia at the beginning of the 1890s signed a series of agreements that made them allies, even though their political systems were quite different. France was, relatively speaking, politically radical. Russia was probably the most conservative power in Europe at that point. So ideologically, they had very little in common, except this concrete opposition to German expansion. And that alliance brought Russia and France into World War I on the same side, and the British joined in as well. So Russia does have a history of being in alliances. But I think you're correct that it's not a fundamental principle of Russian security. Russia is not tended to look at alliances as the way that it seeks to organize its own security. Whereas the United States really does. The United States has alliances with sort of NATO, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. The United States has alliances all over the place. And it's the way that we think about collective security. And the Russians don't tend to do that very much. And likewise, China. China has one treaty ally, and that's North Korea. China does have close relationships with a number of other states, Pakistan, for example, but it has one ally, and that's North Korea. Now, certainly Russia and China have been cooperating very actively in recent years. And there are things that bring them together. For example, Russia produces lots of energy. China needs lots of energy. And so there's an economic connection. The fundamental connection, though, is that, as I read it, both Moscow and Beijing share a common sense that the United States stands in the way of the way they would like to see the world work, which involves this sort of great powers dominate their neighborhoods and tell their neighbors what to do. And they see the US and kind of the Western world more generally as an obstacle to that, as kind of blocking that path. And so, to my mind, the Russia-China relationship is, to a large degree, an alliance of convenience in opposition to the United States. Now, Putin and Xi Jinping have clearly established a personal relationship. There is, it seems, real warmth between them. But fundamentally, it's about opposition to the US. And what's interesting is that there's a fair amount of history that has been suppressed by that. Much of the Russian Far East today used to be Chinese territory. And it was Chinese territory that it was taken away by the Russians by the use of force or the threat of force. When China was in its century of humiliation, when China was falling apart at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. In the 1800s, Russia took and annexed large chunks of Chinese territory. And the People's Republic of China in the past has tended to be fairly touchy about territory that it sees as rightfully belonging to China. That issue has been set aside. And again, the question is how long? Is that an issue that's permanently been resolved, or is that something that might rear its head in the future? Impossible to say.
Do you see a future China-Russian alliance of some sort, military alliance?
You certainly couldn't rule it out. There's a great deal of military cooperation in terms of arms sales and joint exercises. But normally when we say an alliance, we mean something a little bigger. And that would be that in a defensive alliance would be if China is attacked, Russia would come to China's aid. If Russia is attacked, China would come to Russia's aid. Again, I think the chances of NATO attacking Russia are really, really tiny, essentially non-existent. The more ominous question would be an offensive alliance. The issue there, though, is that Russia's key priorities are not Beijing's key priorities. Moscow has things that it cares a lot about, but it doesn't tend to be the things that Beijing cares a lot about. Beijing cares an awful lot about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Cares an awful lot about the states on its immediate borders. Russia cares about things. It cares about the Middle East. It cares what happens in Eastern Europe, but those are not necessarily the things that occupy the Chinese. And so there is certainly a great deal of cooperation. It could certainly get deeper, but the fundamental things that the two governments are concerned about kind of head in different directions, for lack of a better term.
If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about war in Ukraine after everything we've talked about, what would it be?
So it would be to respect the idea that Ukraine is a real country, that Putin is consistently trying to portray Ukraine as a puppet of the West, as kind of Russians who just don't quite understand that they belong with Russia. But it's that Ukraine is a real country, and it's been a real country for 30 years, and Ukrainians have a sense of themselves as their own people and not as Russians. And it's worth bearing that in mind.
Your reference to the 1654 treaty is really informative. That's something that really it's a point in which you realize that Ukraine is truly a different country going back several hundred years ago. Professor Stone, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. You're welcome back to the Peel.News anytime. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective.
Adele, it's been a real pleasure. Delighted to talk to you, and I hope to be back again someday.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'll edit that out. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
There is a book that I want to show you, but my library, it's the history of Crimea, the Crimean War. It's really great. And there is several books that I've read by Massey. Have you read them? Yeah. Catherine the Great and also Peter the Great. And I actually read Peter the Great to my family out loud. That's the beginning parts are very exciting. So we usually air our podcast conversations about 2-3 weeks out.
Okay.
But I've already talked to our previous guests, and I'm going to air this weekend, this Friday, because it's just smack dab in the middle of the news. Thank you so much.
When the news broke last night of the recognition, I was like, okay, well, I'll need to make sure to have that when we talk.
You know, and in the on my app on my iPhone, I got alerts that President Biden has called it an invasion. Apparently, Russian troops have already. Anyway, hopefully there won't be bloodshed. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and I'll follow up with you after I post this publishes. Take care. Bye-bye.
So long.